They always say it's the monster story, but that's not what I saw. What I saw was someone brought into this world, unformed, unprepared, and then left to figure everything out alone. Not taught, not guided, not held, just left. And I couldn't stop thinking about all the people who felt that too. Not monstrous, not evil, just left behind by the ones who should have stayed long enough to teach them how not to break. What hits hardest about Frankenstein isn't the tragedy of science gone wrong. It's the tragedy of responsibility denied, of walking away from something you shaped. Victor doesn't stand over his creation with regret. He runs. Not because it attacked him, not because it did anything wrong, but because he looked at something unfinished and panicked at how real it was. And that's a different kind of fear. It's the fear of intimacy, of obligation, of seeing the full weight of what your influence can do and backing away from it. We don't talk about that enough, how deeply a person can be shaped not just by who raised them, but by who walked away. That's what this story is. It's about a being who comes into the world and finds only rejection. No name, no welcome, no explanation, just cold. And yet he tries, he learns to speak. He watches families from a distance trying to understand gentleness. He wants so badly to belong. He mimics goodness before he even understands it. But no matter how kind he is, no matter how much he learns, he's met with fear. And little by little, that fear teaches him something, that the world doesn't wait for your goodness, that no matter how pure your heart is, people will judge the shape of your body, the sound of your voice, the things they don't understand. That the effort to be kind doesn't guarantee kindness in return. There's this moment that cracked something open in me. He saves a child from drowning. And what does he get? He's shot. No warning, no questions, just punishment. It reminded me of the times I've tried to do the right thing and been told, in one way or another, we don't trust you anyway. How exhausting it is to build bridges with hands that people keep slapping away. And still, he goes on, still he hopes, still he asks, not for worship, not for praise, but for someone like him, someone to talk to recognize him without flinching. And even that's too much. Victor agrees to make him a companion and then destroys her before she ever opens her eyes. I sat with that scene for a long time because you start to wonder, how often do we teach others they're unworthy? Not by words, but by withholding mercy. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was asking for a chance to not go through life alone, to be mirrored in someone else's eyes without fear or shame. He was asking for what most of us take for granted. There's a passage where he says, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel. But what struck me wasn't the reference itself. It was the weight of what he hoped to be. He wasn't demanding greatness. He wasn't angry yet. He was asking to be guided, not abandoned. He was asking to be treated like someone who could learn, could change, could be better, if only someone stayed long enough to teach him how. He never got that. And I think many of us know that feeling. We aren't born cruel. We're born raw. And the people who raise us, shape us, influence us, they fill in the gaps, or they leave them empty. Victor Frankenstein didn't just walk away from a project. He walked away from a responsibility, from something he brought into being and then refused to understand. It's a reminder that neglect can echo louder than violence, that sometimes the worst pain isn't inflicted, it's inherited, not because someone tried to hurt us, but because they never tried to hold us. That's the tragedy of the unnamed being. He never asked to be feared. He asks for language, for warmth, for connection. And every time that he reached out, something burned, a home, a hope, a part of him that was still tender. And after a while, he stopped reaching. Not because he didn't want to, but because the answer was always the same. No, we don't trust you. No, we don't want you. No, we won't teach you how to be gentle, but we will punish you when you're not. I read this story as someone who knows what it's like to be misunderstood, to try to do better and be met with suspicion, to feel like your very presence is a burden someone else regrets. There's a line that says, I am malicious because I am miserable. And I think that's a cry so many people carry in their bones. It's not an excuse, it's a truth. That sadness, when left too long with no witness, curdles, turns into rage, turns into isolation, so sharp it cuts everything in its path. But maybe what hurts most is that he never even got a name, not a real one. He's called creature, fiend, wretch, demon. Because to give him a name would mean admitting he was real, not an error, not a regret, but a being with a story. And that would make his suffering matter. That would make his loneliness inconvenient. By the time the story ends, we're left watching two beings chasing each other across the Arctic. One fleeing his guilt, the other fleeing the world that never gave him a chance. And it's quiet, not explosive, not cathartic, just a kind of cold that feels like the only logical ending for a soul who was taught that his warmth would never be welcomed. Frankenstein is a tragedy, but not the kind with thunder and lightning. It's the kind you carry in your chest long after the book is closed. Because what it's really asking is, what happens to someone who's been shaped more by absence than presence? What becomes of a soul that tried to be soft, but was never handled gently enough to stay that way? There's kind of pain people don't know what to do with. The pain of someone who was hurt so early and so silently that by the time they start screaming, it's easier to judge their volume than ask where it came from. That's the creature's grief. By the time anyone listens, it's already too loud to be sympathetic. He wanted understanding. What he got was fear. He wanted fairness. What he got was labels. And when he finally broke, that moment became the only part of him people remembered. Isn't that how we often treat real people, too? We forget the days they tried to be gentle. We forget how long they stayed quiet before they cracked. We only remember the fire, not the years they were gathering rain. Victor's absence isn't a passive detail. It's the architecture of the creature's pain. Imagine entering the world as a blank slate, reaching for kindness with both hands and getting silence instead. Not even rejection with words, just silence, no explanation, no reason, no guidance. We underestimate how much that can twist a person. When you're met with nothing, you build your beliefs from scraps, and usually they're wrong. He thought he was unworthy, unwanted. He thought every closed door meant something about him, but it didn't. It meant something about the people who built those doors and chose to shut them. What stayed with me wasn't his rage. It was how long he resisted it. He could have lashed out early. Instead, he watched, learned, served, tried. Even after being beaten, shot, screamed at, he still asked for love. That's not the mark of a monster. That's the mark of someone who was desperate to believe there was still a place in the world where he could belong. And when that final hope was taken, it wasn't just anger that emerged. It was the mourning of someone who realized, I will never be seen for who I am, only what they fear I might be. Victor sees himself as the victim. He spends most of the book narrating his guilt, his stress, his torment. But guilt is not the same as repentance. Regret is not the same as responsibility. He fears what the creature becomes, but refuses to look at the path that led him there. There's a certain kind of selfishness that hides behind anguish, the kind that says, I feel bad, so that should count for something. But it doesn't. Not if the one you hurt is still carrying your absence like a wound they're not allowed to speak about. When the creature confronts Victor, it's not a battle. It's a plea. He doesn't ask for power. He asks for fairness. He asks, shall each man find a wife for his bosom, and each beast have his mate, and I be alone? That's the line that undid me because behind it is a pain that most of us would never say out loud. Why does everyone get to be loved except me? It's not jealousy. It's not entitlement. It's the ache of watching the world function normally for everyone but you. It's being on the outside of something you didn't even know you were supposed to be part of. And when he's denied, again, the only companionship he's ever asked for, the quiet thread that held him together, finally unravels. But here's the hardest part to admit. There's a part of me that understood him, not in the violence, not in the hurt he causes, but in the exhaustion of proving your worth when no one is willing to meet you halfway, in the fear that no matter how much you grow or how much you give, the world will still define you by your first failure, or worse, by your face. I've seen people soften at Victor's despair, but his sorrow doesn't make him noble, because sorrow without ownership isn't humility, it's vanity. He could have protected people. He could have told the truth. He could have turned toward what he abandoned. Instead, he kept chasing his pain in circles and called it justice. But justice would have meant telling the world what he made. It would have meant facing the being he turned away from, and doing it before blood was shed. Justice would have meant seeing the creature's grief as real. Instead, Victor only sees it when it's too late. And even then, he narrates the story like how he's the one who's been wronged. So there's a passage where the creature says, "I desired love and fellowship, and I was still spurned. Was there no injustice in this?" And for once, he doesn't sound monstrous at all. He sounds like someone who's been aching to be allowed to be human, but hasn't been given the language, the chance, or the witness. How many people live their lives like this, begging to be understood in a world that only listens to the ones who speak calmly and look the part? In many ways, Frankenstein is about judgment, about how quick we are to form opinions based on appearances, how slow we are to ask what led someone to become who they are, how uncomfortable it is to acknowledge that we might have had a role in someone else's undoing. It's easier to label someone difficult than admit they've been carrying a weight we helped build. It's easier to say they're dangerous than ask why they're afraid. And that brings us to the final cruelty. Not the violence, not even the loneliness, but the fact that the creature, after everything, still feels responsible. He blames himself. He takes the pain of everyone around him and wears it like a name. Because that's what happens when no one ever tells you you were never the problem. You start to believe that if you hadn't existed, everyone would have been better off. And you walk into the snow alone, not because you want to, but because you think it's the kindest thing you can do for the world that didn't want you. That final scene broke me, not because he disappears into the Arctic, but because he disappears thinking that's all he deserved. He thinks his grief made him unworthy, when in reality, it's his grief that made him most human. But no one stayed long enough to tell him that. There's a kind of person we don't make space for. Not the soft-spoken, not the perfectly packaged, not the obviously broken, but the person who's just complicated, the one who makes people uncomfortable, who asks too many questions, who says too much, who's been hurt in a way that makes them loud or awkward or hard to read. The creature was that kind of person. And what's unbearable about Frankenstein is realizing how quickly we decide someone like that is unworthy of gentleness. Every time he asked for kindness, someone recoiled. Every time he tried to show his heart, someone ran, until eventually he stopped offering it at all. It's not that he didn't want to be good, it's that goodness, in his experience, always went unanswered. And after enough silence, even the best parts of a person can start to rot. The people around him never looked past what they feared, not even once. They didn't ask what he needed. They didn't ask where he came from. They didn't even ask his name because they didn't want to give him one. Because names mean recognition. Recognition means accountability, and it's easier to fear someone than admit you might owe them something. There's a moment where he says, "I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend." And that doesn't sound like a villain. It sounds like someone whose goodness was never fed, like someone who kept giving the best of himself to people who only ever looked for the worst. When you read Frankenstein slowly, you start to feel how much of it is about mercy withheld. The kind of mercy that could have stopped everything but wasn't offered, not because the creature wasn't worthy, but because the people around him never paused long enough to find out that he was. He wasn't just unloved, he was unwitnessed. And that's a grief few people can put into words. To have everything inside you, the love, the learning, the longing, and to realize no one stayed long enough to see any of it. We talk so much about forgiveness and compassion, but what about the people who needed compassion before they ever made a mistake? What about the ones who were punished for being different long before they did anything wrong? Yeah, this story haunted me because it made something clear. We don't just create pain by what we do. We create it by what we don't do, by the chances we don't give, by the assumptions we don't correct, by the presence we withhold from those who need it most. There's a strange kind of comfort in this book, if you can survive the ache, because what Mary Shelley did was name something that many of us were taught never to speak aloud, that being misunderstood can shape you, that being unloved doesn't make you unlovable, but it can convince you that you are. That some people aren't born bad, they just never got the language of gentleness spoken to them. Victor wasn't the only one with power. The villagers, the families, the strangers, they all had it too. The power to meet fear with curiosity, to meet difference with patience. But none of them used it, and so what could have been a peaceful life turned into a life lived in defense mode. How many people live like that now, always bracing, always expecting rejection, always filtering themselves so they don't come on too strong or make people uncomfortable or ask for too much, not because they're difficult, but because they've been told they are, over and over and over again. You start to realize something painful when you sit with this story long enough. The creature didn't fail. He was failed. He wasn't broken. He was broken down, not by a single person, but by a series of missed opportunities. Moments when someone could have seen him, spoken to him, taught him a different way to exist. And they didn't. So he learned what the world gave him. And when what you're given is fear and shame and punishment, you start to believe that's all there is. This book holds up a mirror to those of us who've ever tried to earn love by being palatable, to those who've made themselves smaller so they wouldn't be left again, to those who learned that vulnerability isn't always met with kindness, but showed up anyway. And it quietly asks, who do we label difficult just because we didn't stay long enough to understand them? It made me think of that kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being constantly misread. That invisible ache of knowing you're more than how people see you, but not knowing how to convince them of being trapped in someone else's story about you. And that's what the creature was. He was never the author of his own life. He was just written into other people's fears. And once people write you as a threat, it's almost impossible to rewrite yourself as anything else. But here's where it really hurts. Even in the end, the creature doesn't demand sympathy. He doesn't try to change the story. He just walks out of it. And something about that silence, about that wordless exit, feels more tragic than anything he ever said, because it speaks to a type of exhaustion that doesn't even want justice anymore. It just wants release. I think some of us carry that same quiet fatigue of always being too much or not enough, of trying to get people to see what we meant, not just what we did, of hoping someone will finally read us correctly. And if you've ever felt that, if you've ever tried to hand someone your heart and watch them flinch, then you already understand this story, maybe better than anyone.